Welcome to Discussion Points, where we're taking a data-driven look at the biggest issues and news stories shaping U.S. politics. I'm Myra Miller, co-founder of the Winston Group, a strategy and survey research firm in Washington, D.C. I'm joined today by David Winston, president of the Winston Group and weekly columnist for Roll Call. Today, we're going to be digging into the numbers behind the news, questioning narratives, and challenging some conventional political assumptions. We hope that what we're highlighting today will be helpful to you so that you can make informed decisions and decide for yourself. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the DNC campaign autopsy and what happened in the 2024 presidential election. For several months, DNC Chairman Ken Martin has taken heat from his fellow Democrats for not releasing the party's internal report about what happened in the 2024 election and why the Harris campaign lost. He finally released the almost 200-page report, and let's just say it's caused quite the stir among Democrats. So in the spirit of reaching across the aisle, we're going to be doing an entire show today about our take on the 2024 election and the fallout from the DNC campaign report. So let's get started. David, why are after-action reports important for any campaign?
Well, it's more than just any campaign. It's for anybody involved in a particular situation to better understand what they did right and what they did wrong. And that's the whole purpose of an after-action report, is what are the lessons learned so you can be better the next time you face it. This is a classic military thing in terms of when you've got military actions, there are always after-action reports. And the point isn't to assign blame, it's to understand what happened in such a way so that everybody can learn lessons so the next time they're better. The problem with this particular one, and I will have to say this is sort of a huge thing. The thing about after-action reports, and when I was director of planning for Speaker Gingrich, I had several situations where I did after-action reports. And the two big elements that aren't here is you need a clear timeline of what occurred, what happened at this point, the next point, so that you have a sequence of events. Then those sequence of events define the decisions made either prior to it that led to that event or the decisions made to sort of deal with that event, that those are what get evaluated. And then people figure out, in fact, what the lessons learned are. There is none of that really in this report. And so therefore, I mean, it's just gobbledygook. It's a lot of interesting random facts structured in some way, but not structured as an after-action report, but structured in such a way to just sort of present a whole variety of things that whoever the author was here decided they wanted to present.
Right. Well, after we saw what was in the report, we had more understanding about why Ken Martin
we did.
didn't want to release it. And he said when he received the report late last year, it wasn't ready for prime time. It wasn't even close. The report has been widely panned, including among Democrats. The Pod Save America, the progressive podcast host, said Martin has a credibility problem now. They said they felt lied to about the report and that this is indicative of a larger problem. The New Hampshire Democratic Party chair said it's a hot mess. So Democrats are really unhappy about this. And I think the situation might have been worse once they saw what was in it. And some Democrats are even calling for Martin's resignation over this, as this was the last straw. Do you think they're overreacting, or is it really that something they are taking that seriously?
I mean, the bigger challenge for the Democratic Party isn't how you respond to this report. It's the information you didn't get that you should have gotten. I mean, you hear, and you've seen this as well in terms of Democrats saying, well, look, we know what happened. I mean, basically, Biden stayed in too long, and so she didn't have a chance to really get her campaign going. And of course, there was the economy. Well, yeah, those are two specific dynamics. But what are the decisions around how they handled all that and what they should have done, what they did right, what they did wrong? They have no idea. So therefore, the whole purpose of this isn't to reaffirm existing beliefs. The whole purpose of an after-action report is, again, I go back to the phrase lessons learned, and Democrats don't have that.
Well, we see a lot of campaigns on both sides where an after-action report is not done at all. And losses are attributed to, was a bad candidate or they didn't raise enough money. We see that all the time. So the fact that they even made an attempt, at least that's a good thing. But it sounds like many of the donors coming out of the loss in November 2024 were demanding it. And in terms of what was or wasn't in the report, it's been reported that many DNC committee members wanted a full accounting of how the campaign money was spent, and they're upset the report doesn't address what happened with the consultants. NBC had an article about this where they said there were jittery donors that are second guessing whether they can trust the DNC with their money. The New York Times had reported that 4 companies involved in the campaign had received at least 90 million in payments. One really received about 300 million. All that would be available at fec.gov and the FEC reports. But there are a number of firms that made a lot of money. And in fact, the Harris campaign had over $1 billion. Money was no object. So it's no surprise that donors want to know how the money was spent.
And the bottom line was resources were not a problem for the Harris
Right.
campaign. What it was is the use of those resources and the decisions made around those resources. And so if you're a donor, you're sort of saying, how did you decide to spend money like that seemed to be fruitless in terms of a result?
Mhm. And that's a very legitimate request
Oh,
from the
yes.
donors, because you think about if this
Right.
was a private sector company that blew through $1 billion in 107 days, people could go to jail for that. Okay, so we have both gone through the report of 192 pages, and we're going to both talk about a point or two that stood out. There are a lot of things that have been highlighted from this report, but I'm going to ask you to start. What stands out to you, good or
Well,
bad?
I'm going to go back to the very core element here. The core element here is try to understand exactly how close it was and how they lost. And in the report, basically he focused on that there was the margin for the 2024 presidency was 270,000 votes across 4 states. Now that's an interesting number, but actually it was closer than that, which means they didn't even get the basic premise of what they were looking at trying to understand, because it wasn't across 4 states. In fact, it was only 3 states. What he did, just as a quick aside for everybody's
You're talking
watching,
about the author of the report.
yeah, the author of the report. What they did is they got the states lined up, and rather than what they did is they sorted it on the numeric margin, the vote margin, as opposed to the percentage margin. Had he done it on the percentage margin, he would have found that there were only 3 states where the margin was less than 2%. And those 3 states were Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. That, in fact, would have provided 44 additional electoral votes, which would have gotten them to 270. Interesting enough, so instead of the 270,000, it ended up being only 229,000. So the basic premise for trying to begin to think through putting together timelines and decisions was based on what would have taken to win, and the person who wrote it didn't have that right.
Well, the report is rife with mistakes that has been widely publicized. And in fact, in the report itself, there are many notations of inconsistencies, no sourcing, and just outright mistakes, as you were just pointing out.
No, and let me do one other, and that is the races that he focused on in terms of trying to contrast with how the presidential was doing. He focused on the governor's races in North Carolina and Washington. Maybe to try to understand things better, he should have focused on the Senate races in Wisconsin where Democrats won and she lost, and the Senate race in Michigan where the Democratic candidate won and she lost. What exactly was the difference there in terms of those races versus the presidential race? And there was virtually nothing in this report trying to think through that dynamic. Myra, so having said that, what are the things that you saw in the report that you thought are notable and worth commenting on?
Well, we could only pick 2, so we'll be a lot. So there were the 2 that stood out to me. So the first one was on page 60 of the report, where they said the retrospective evaluation of Donald Trump's presidency was too positive. Given the ability of right-wing entities to slash and smear the vice president, it was essential to prosecute a more effective case as to why Trump should have been disqualified from ever again taking office. The grounds were there, but the messaging did not make a case. It's stunning to me how anyone could think that they could have gone more negative against Donald Trump. I think not just in the campaign, but everything that's been said about him in the years preceding the campaign. Don't know what else could have been said there, but somehow they believe that they didn't go negative enough and that somehow Democrats would have benefited if they had chosen to go more scorched earth, even if that's
And
inaccurate.
if I can add one thing to the point that you're just making, okay, think about the last time that Trump won. Wasn't that basically Hillary Clinton's strategy? How negative can you be?
Mhm.
Remember the children watching the ad in terms of some things that Donald Trump had said and done, as though, who could possibly vote for him? I mean, the
Well, they did.
and the problem that you run into, to your point, was, okay, so they didn't like Donald Trump. Is that a validating element to vote for the Democrat then?
And she wasn't developed as an alternative to him. And because of the
Right.
economy, voters were looking for change, and she was not the candidate of change. Trump clearly was the candidate of change. Well, the second point, if there's a single nugget of truth in this report that Democrats would be wise to take away, it's on page 62. And the report says, the problem is Harris lost the economic argument. The national exit polling indicates Harris lost the 32% of voters who identified the economy as their most important issue, 18 to 81. And they lost voters middle income, earning between 30,000 and 100,000, 46 to 52. So at least they acknowledge, yes, she lost the economic argument. It wasn't a messaging problem, it was a policy problem. But if there was one takeaway from this report the Democrats would be wise to learn from, it's that.
And as everybody sort of was aware, given the fact that you had a 21.4% increase in prices during Biden's term, it's not a surprise that the economy was the number one issue. And yet Democrats couldn't figure out, or the campaign couldn't figure out, in fact, how to manage that and deal with that.
Because they couldn't talk about inflation.
Right.
And that was
And
a huge problem.
Given that was
Right.
the number one issue, when you can't talk
Right.
about the number one
Yeah.
issue, that's kind of a problematic
And voters believed that Biden policies had made inflation worse. So it is understandable they could never find ways to talk about the economy in a credible way, which leads to our next discussion, which is our take on what happened in the 2024 election. Now, we have a full post-election report. It's available on our website at winstongroup.net, and it's based on exit polls, and they're available nationally and in the states, and our own survey of voters who voted in that election. So we're going to highlight some of those takeaways about what we think happened in that election.
Okay, so I'm going to start off with, and actually, I'm not actually going to go to our polls. I want to go to the exit polls. So if you hold on, I am going to, surprise, fire up a chart. And so, and here it comes. Okay, so what you're looking at here is exit polls in terms of the party ID of the composition of the electorate going from 1984 forward. Okay, and the first thing to sort of note about this is the blue line is the Democrats, the red line is Republicans, and the green line is independents. Okay, the first thing to note is in the prior 10 elections, look at how consistent Democrats were as a portion of the electorate. They ranged basically from 36 to 39%. I mean, pretty consistent over time. But what you see happen here in terms of this particular election, this is stunning. What you saw was a 6% decrease in terms of the portion of the electorate that was identifying as Democrats. And so going from 37% down to 31, just to give you a sense, that represents about 10 million less people in this election identifying as Democrats. Okay. Now, in contrast to that, what you saw was what that produced for Republicans was, you see, Republicans came in at 35%. And Democrats came in 31%. And that was a 4-point party ID advantage for Republicans. That's the largest in the history of exit polling. The other thing to note, it wasn't like Republicans did well here either. If you notice there, they went from 36 to 35, so they went down 1 point. And this gets to sort of the key outcome in terms of what occurred in this, and that is looking at independents. Independents went from 27% to 34%. 34%. That meant there were more independents in this voting in this election than Democrats. Okay, the last time you have a party where they were finishing third, you have to go all the way back to Watergate, to find a party that came in third. And they came in third at 31. And by the way, this was pretty consistent across all the states, where you saw in most of the competitive states, independents finishing ahead of Democrats. And so
this is not only a national trend, it happened in 5 out of the 7 competitive presidential states. And I haven't heard this I have hardly heard this discussed in the media.
No, I've only heard one Democrat actually mention this, and that's Rahm Emanuel. But there's another element here, and now we get back to the value of an after action report. not all of that is just simply 10 million Democrats didn't vote and all of a sudden 10 million independents came out of nowhere and voted. What that's a mix of, and I'm not sure what that mix is that there were probably some Democrats, given Biden's economic program, decided that didn't want to identify as Democrats. They want to identify as independents. They were still probably Democrats, but they were identifying as independents. What that scale is and what that relationship is unclear, which is one of the reasons why you would want to do an after action report. But that clearly occurred, and that's a real challenge for Democrats moving forward.
Well, in terms of what drove these pretty seismic shifts in the makeup of the electorate, voters' top priority was the economy, and it was not abortion that the Harris campaign wanted to focus on. There was record inflation, he pointed out, under Biden, with the cumulative price increases of over 21%, and the campaign just never could overcome that. As a result, the view of the economy was very negative. The exit polls showed 68% of the electorate view the economy as not so good or poor, as opposed to only 31% who saw the economy as excellent or good. So Democrats tried to take the focus off of inflation and the economy. They just couldn't find a way to talk about it. They hoped to try to mobilize their base on abortion, but the rise of independence clearly was around the economy, and that was something that they just could never overcome. And Kamala Harris was not able to, of her own choosing, was never able to separate from Biden and his record. So that gets to how the two candidates were viewed. I think you have a comparison chart for Harris and Trump.
Yep. And what you're looking at here is the fave unfave, and what you see is virtually it's the same. Harris had, and this is also from the exit polls. Harris was at 46.52. Trump was basically the same number at 46.53. So at the end here, both candidates were viewed negatively. And that was part of the challenge here. And that's one of the reasons why you saw independents sort of grow, because there wasn't satisfaction in terms of the two who was running. And what that led to was sort of a more even split amongst independents.
One comment I'd have about this is that she had a negative image as well as Trump, whereas in 2020 against Biden, Biden had a positive image in that election, which was a tremendous asset to him. And so that made it easier for voters who didn't like Trump, who had a negative image, that when the positive image of Biden made it easier for those that didn't like Trump to vote for him. Whereas that dynamic did not exist here, and the Harris campaign did not positively define her as the alternative.
And again, taking a look at this, understand the element that occurred here for Harris. She was walking into a situation where Joe Biden had really tanked with independents. Joe Biden won independents by 13 back in 2020. But in terms of again, the exit polls in this race, overall, his job approval was 40% approve, 59% disapprove. But amongst independents, it was a staggering 34 to 66. And so what you saw happen here, and I'm going to show you one more here. What you saw happen here was the vote amongst independents. Again, you see Biden winning by 13 and Harris only winning by 3. And literally across every single one of those 7 competitive states, Trump improved significantly in terms of his performance amongst independents. And that really was the difference. And that was multiplied by the fact that independents grew from 27 to 34. This was also, let me go to 2 other groups because I think it's sort of important to do this. Well, one everybody knows pretty well, and that is when you take a look at the vote amongst Hispanics back in 2016, Clinton overwhelmingly won them. Biden in 2020 by about the same margin. But what you see in this particular election was that it was quite close. Democrats still won, but by the much slimmer margin of 51 to 46. One more group. And this is the one that's that every time you and I have gone through this and presented this, people have been surprised by, and that is the vote amongst women. Again, going to the point that you were just made about the focus on abortion, and you would have thought that would have driven the women's vote. But what you see is Hillary Clinton won them by 13, 54 to 41. Biden actually expanded that in 2020, going to 57 to 42. By the way, quick aside, one of the reasons when you go to the 2018 election, Republican congressional candidates nationwide lost women by 19 points. And so that's why you see it go from -13 to -15. But here you have the issue of abortion. And yet Harris ended up winning women by about half the margin that Joe Biden did, only winning them by 8. And so you have three major groups, independents, Hispanics, and women, all trending toward Trump. And again, why do you need an after action report? Because you want to understand why that happened. So,
Well, and we've seen in the gubernatorial races last fall in Virginia and New Jersey that Democrats have had much stronger performances among women around the economy and affordability, unlike what happened in 2024 when they were trying to run on abortion.
let me add to that. Agreed and very much agree in terms of the women, but also independents as well have had that similar reaction.
I want to also flag another quote from the DNC report that stood out to me. The White House did not position or prepare the vice president. Had the White House explored and evaluated ways to leverage Kamala Harris earlier in the administration, perhaps it would have improved the president's standing, and it certainly could have helped prepare her to lead the ticket. So that statement seemed to throw the Biden White House under the bus on the loss that they're saying, well, they didn't do enough to help develop her. And we heard reports of this before the campaign when she was vice president, that there was a feeling that she was not given enough issues to lead on. She was not given enough opportunity, and that they felt that she was not being developed on issues that would have highlighted her strengths.
Interesting point, but let's go take a look at surveys. Okay. And so I'm going to do real clear politics average here. The day that Biden dropped out, July 21st, 2024, Donald Trump had a 3.1% lead over Biden. By the time you got to August 5th, Harris took the lead. Okay. And looking at the real clear politics average day by day, she held that through October 25th. So you go from August 5th to October 25th, where she was in the lead, and they couldn't do anything with that lead. They didn't figure out how to actually turn that. And then as a result, what you saw at the end was actually her final margin in the last real clear politics average was 0.1%, right? So basically a toss up. And Trump ended up winning by 1.47%. But think about that. Everybody's talking about, oh, she didn't have time. Oh, she wasn't positioned. Well, she held the lead for an extended period of time, at least according to the real clear politics average.
Which is the average of the major polls that are coming out.
Yes. Now, could she have been set up better by the Biden administration in terms of how they handled her? Yeah. Also in the report, they were talking about how they were doing surveys to sort of understand Jill Biden's persona and what she could potentially be doing to help President Biden. And they weren't really doing the same for Vice President Harris. So, yeah, they probably could have been doing more. But let's not underestimate at least where her starting position was. And they had a chance here that they just simply didn't understand what that opportunity was.
Well, in October before the election, she went on The View and was asked what would she have done differently than Biden. So she was given an opportunity to try to separate from him. And she said, not a thing that comes to mind. So she was not able to, or she chose not to create a distinct policy agenda from him. And in the end, she was tied to his policies.
And when you take, again, looking at the real clear politics average and how the numbers move, that particular interview occurred on October 8th, but shortly after that is you could see the line sort of begin to close. I would suggest to you that of all the things that happened to Harris in terms of defining her and how she was dealing with the race, that particular moment was probably the critical one.
Well, she is making some overtures, like she might be considering running in 2028. Some might be happy about that. Some Democrats are not. So she is likely to be seeking some absolution about the 2024 campaign, that it wasn't her fault, which many Democrats believe that Biden's reelection attempt doomed the Harris campaign from the start. And the fact that this DNC report doesn't address that is going to be a real sticking point for Democrats for some time to come.
And to be fair, I mean, They did not hand this off well to her, so she was positioned in a way to be in the strongest position she could have been. There is no question about that. And so the Biden administration, the Biden team should take responsibility for not having done that well. But again, Harris has to look to her own team, given where she ended up standing, again, going back to that time frame where she actually had the there was something that they could have done as well, which now we go back to the fundamental beginning of all this. That's why you do an after action report so you can look at all this and figure out what lessons are learned, what you could have done better, what you did do right to sort of move things forward. And this report doesn't match what was needed for the Democratic Party.
Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it for this week. We'll be talking a lot more about the 2024 election future podcast, but that's all the time we have for today. So to wrap it up, the first election of Trump in 2016 was a rejection of the status quo and the political establishment, but the 2024 election was a rejection of the policy direction of the Biden-Harris administration. The Kamala Harris campaign never could find ways to overcome that, and by focusing on abortion and the issue of democracy, they were not addressing the electorate's top concern, which was inflation and the economy. So more on that. If you're interested in our post-election report, our take on everything, it's available at our website at winstongroup.net. Thanks everybody for joining us this week. Check out our website for more resources. We'll be back next week. Stay tuned for more discussion points.